Right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back in the new studio, which still is under construction, but we're getting there. We hope it provides a little bit more amenity to you at home. It's certainly more amenable in the studio. Welcome back, Mikey. How are you?
G'day, Shane. Good, thanks. How about yourself?
I'm great, and it's awesome to have Mike in Auckland. He's formerly from Wellington. He's in the big smoke. He's practicing in Devonport. His firm's called Devon Lane. He's just been accredited by the New Zealand Law Society practice on his own account, which is an honour bestowed among few. I somehow got through that net many moons ago now, but it's really cool to have another really capable, I shouldn't say another, very capable young practitioner like Mike in Auckland to be in cahoots with. He's great around problem solving and mediating disputes, and that's really where Devon Lane, Mike, I understand, is placing itself in the market.
Yeah, that's correct, Shane. I mean, we're going to be canvassing most sort of areas of commercial law, but the focus is certainly very much on dispute resolution and deal making.
And what sort of stuff are you working on at the moment, mate?
A mix of things. At the moment, we've got a complex franchisor dispute that's been occupying a lot of my time this week, and a range of different issues.
We've got a few franchise related. We've got a dispute ongoing at the moment, which is a really interesting one. I can't talk about it because I know at least one of a few people that watch the stream are, may see this, so I won't be unprofessional and talk about that. And we've got a much more exciting one where the new lawyers for Chipmunks, the play centre cafes all around New Zealand and Australia and now the US as well. And that's a real coup for our small firm, Lateral Lawyers, and we're very proud of that. They're a Dunedin-based family business, really, really cool people, and we're really grateful to another client of ours for referring them to us. We're currently doing a bit of a redraft of some of the franchise documentation. It's challenging for Liam Carley, our junior, and he's all over that. And he looked like he'd had a serious migraine headache when he left today, just being absolutely getting owned by clauses up to his eyeballs, and franchisees being stitched up every way to Sunday. But it's all part of the game. And if anyone out there watching wants any more of a mini treatise about what to watch out for in a good franchisor, or a bad one for that matter, check out my video, I should say, a couple of days ago, speaking exactly to that matter. Today's little session that Mike and I are doing, we're a little bit out of practice, aren't we, Mike? We're just saying we're a bit cold. Engine hasn't started. Both really busy, but we wanted to get back into the swing of it now that Mike's in Auckland. So tonight's probably going to be, I don't want to say it's going to be rusty because it implies being otherwise smooth, but tonight's going to be a little bit rusty, but we want to get back in the saddle in the new studio and have a little discussion about what it means to be a commercial landlord in 2021. I'll just briefly kick it off. So in 2021, I think, and Gary Vaynerchuk, one of the people I really enjoy listening to over in the US, talking about how back in the, really any time until now, for that matter, I was going to say back in the 80s or 90s, normal asset classes to invest in were relatively passive: stocks, real estate, art. Now you've got cryptocurrency, you've got NFTs, you've got basketball cards, one of my favorite addiction / investment areas, and just a whole lot of stuff which has a kind of flex or an ownership aspect to it as well with people coming through. But property really still, particularly in New Zealand, because we weren't affected by the whole GFC meltdown and sort of perceived weakness in property as an investment class. And Mike will speak more to that than I will because it's more his area. But so like in New Zealand, we definitely have this preoccupation still with property. I think I saw on the Bloomberg ticket that I always have going on in the studio here day and night that New Zealand, I think it was Switzerland or Sweden and Canada, are the three most bubbly housing markets in the world, which is a big statement to think that we are one of three of the most inflated house prices in the world. So, Mike, do you want to speak a little bit about property as an investment in 2021, and then we'll move more to the specifics of landlords and any advice that we could give to them?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, one thing, sort of leading on from what you were saying, is that commercial property as an investment class is becoming a lot more attractive to people as the government sort of tightens the rules around residential realty. That investment class is becoming increasingly less attractive, much harder to be involved in, and so there's been a real uptick in interest from people in investing in commercial property instead. But at the same time that's the case, the banks are very reluctant to lend at present on commercial property. That's something I've seen with a few different clients over the last 6-month period, is that lending against existing commercial property for the purposes of further investment, or lending to buy commercial property, is a much harder thing than it has been to date.
Why is that?
The only reason I can think of is that the banks perceive that it's an area of high risk. And that's quite interesting because it isn't actually reflected in what's gone on to date or what's going on. Like if you look at, you hear a lot of people talk anecdotally, Shane, about, offices vacant on Queen Street, or a lot of empty buildings around the place. But if you actually look at the data, and I've reviewed the latest data from this year in, I believe, April, you find that there is an uptick in the vacancy rate in Auckland and Wellington and the other major centres of the country, but you're not looking at a dramatic shift. Maybe. Do you want
to roll out some stats for us?
Yeah, I mean, for example, the CBD is probably the worst affected. You've got an increase from 2019 to 2020. That's December to December, of 4.7 to 8.8%. So that's quite a jump. Wellington, you've got much less of an increase at 6.1 to 6.9. And the rest of the country is kind of in between. Now, even though the Auckland figure sounds like a reasonably large one, a thing to bear in mind is that that's coming off an historically very low base in terms of vacancy rates. So we've had a really good run in commercial property up till COVID. And so the sort of figures for vacancy you're seeing are not exactly outside of the spectrum of what would be, what a commercial investor would deal with in the ordinary course of business. But that leads us back to the bank issue, which is, why is there this reluctance to lend? And the only plausible reason I can think of is that the banks must have projections that suggest that there's at least a risk that picture isn't going to last into the new year.
In the macro?
Yeah. I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, if economists could correctly predict this stuff, we'd only need one economist, right? And predictions have been all over the show since COVID started. But I think there is a general perception that the economic success to date and the surprising GDP figures may be predicated on a lot of borrowing, and that the picture might not remain as pleasant going forward. And I mean, who can say really? That may or may not be the case, but certainly the banks are taking a conservative approach.
What about, I'm putting you on the spot here, but do you know anything about any analogous figures in other countries, or even just anecdotally trends?
I don't, to be honest with you, Shane. I mean, I do know to go into the sort of area you're talking about with residential property prices.
Yep.
I know, for example, that I think in Auckland now the earnings to the ratio between income and housing is, I think, 12. And if you look at Australia, the worst parts of Australia, like Melbourne or Sydney, are up around 8 or 9. And you've got cities like Brisbane and Perth, which are on 4. So
it's bad.
I can say that Auckland is certainly out of step with the rest of the kind of developed Pacific
regions. That's quite scary. 12, is it?
Yeah.
Wow.
It's a lot.
maybe it is a bona fide reason to have a whinge about house prices.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's, the writing's on the wall that the government is very concerned about it. They've made a lot of steps to date to try and curtail the rise in house prices. They don't appear yet to have been successful, but I think that's what makes residential realty a rather troubling asset class at the moment, is that while house price rises continue, as an investor in that asset class, you're just really on the hook for whatever perverse sort of changes to the economy, whatever distortions the present government wants to try next. And that could be a range of things. I think the thing people fear most is some sort of potentially a rent freeze. That's one that's been mooted quite widely.
Does it also make it, for that same reason, ironically, a very attractive investment class, though?
I mean, I think...
or at least the perceived attractive investment class.
Well, I think that would depend on how much... I mean, at some point, the expectations are going to get priced into the market, right? And I don't know if that's happened to date. I was talking anecdotally to someone I know who's a reasonably major property investor earlier in the year, and we were both sort of saying that, if some of these government interventions have an effect, and the one we were talking about in particular was the inability to deduct interest as an expense on residential rentals. We thought if that had a major effect, if that was priced in the way it should be and reflected in the sale prices, then it would become a very tempting asset class, because of course there's a very high chance that when the government changes, and governments always change, that the new government will reverse that policy, at which point prices will correspondingly shoot back up. But nothing that's occurred since that's happened has really gone the way people thought it may.
Interesting what you said. I'm just going to pick up and run with that comment you made about investors being essentially at the whim of the then government, and you talked about rent freezes. I've given you that referral for my family friend, old mate. We call him old mate, and old mate tried to get rid of a... It's all right. He's definitely not on Facebook, I can assure you of that. Old mate gave a tenant a notice to vacate sometime late in 2020. Then the tenant was given... This tenant is wildly problematic, to the extent that even the biggest Labour / social welfare apologist would struggle to make a case defending some of the egregious behaviours of this particular tenant. So he gave notice. Our landlord client late last year didn't want to spend money on lawyers, didn't want to... just thought, quite rightly, really, when you think about it, why should he have to spend money on lawyers? And he's got plenty of money, but why should he have to spend money on lawyers to give a tenant notice to leave the property, when the law at the time allowed a notice for no fault eviction? Anyway, he cocked it up, and through a series of pleas of clemency from the tenant, and a lot of leeway, I've got to say, given to him by the tribunal, our client, who I've referred to Mike, because things have got really difficult. We never actually acted for him, but because we don't do that kind of dispute work. But Mike's very... we're very glad Mike's taken it up, and this poor guy now is in a situation where he has to essentially argue that notice was given under the old legislation, which means that the no-fault tenancy or eviction provisions or possibility applies still, and or he has to go back through. And I tell you what, it was sobering, Mike, when I first had a look at it and was deciding who to refer it to. It was sobering reading what hoops a landlord in that situation now has to jump through to evict someone. Do you just want to speak a little bit to...
Yeah, sure.
That so maybe from a policy level, before we talk about, obviously not specifics of our case, of old mate's case, but specifics of that problem in general, and just how sobering it is when you're faced with it right in your, your grill, when you're actually realizing this is going to be a real shtick for landlords.
Well, it's very interesting policy. I mean, in broad strokes, what's happened is that the ability that used to exist to terminate a tenancy for no fault has now been replaced with a situation where, as long as a tenant wants to stay, that tenant can stay, even if you've had a fixed term lease. Once that lease ceases to be fixed term, the tenant can remain on a periodic tenancy for as long as they choose to. Now, there are circumstances where you can still evict a tenant, but they've become quite limited. So you can do it if you or a family member wishes to move into the house. You can do it if you wish to sell a house. And in both those cases, the time period you have to give for notice has increased quite dramatically. And then the third, and the one that's most relevant here, is that if the tenant doesn't pay rent or engages in antisocial behaviour, you can evict them. But the process has changed to one where that there has to be, I believe, something like 3 separate incidents over a certain period of months, and you have to provide notice in respect of each one.
And you have to show that, you have to document them, don't you?
You do.
Yeah.
And I mean, I believe that there's more of a process where you have to approach the tenancy tribunal for things too. Like it's all become just a lot more complicated, a lot more legalistic.
I mean, I don't know enough about it, and I'm not going to be critical of the government because of that. So I don't have enough information, but this is just completely freestyling here. I don't know a lot of instances of where landlords have acted in a way at scale whereby this was justified or necessary. It seems a massive swing the other way.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it would be fair to say that most landlords, if their tenant is paying the rent and, you know, behaving and not causing damage, they want them to be there and to remain there. And so this kind of desire to achieve a greater level of certainty for tenants, I mean, there might be cases, I'm sure there are cases that justify it. There are always bad landlords, just as there are always bad tenants. And I can understand, at least on one level, the government's desire to allow people to have a greater sense of security in the house they live in.
That's fine. I have no issue with it, with that. But going as far as to say that a landlord, essentially, as long as the tenant pays the rent, can't actually get rid of them.
Well, I am setting up for a big but there from a policy perspective, which is, and the but is that if you're concerned about the security of people in housing, and you're going through a period where housing is limited, period. There's not enough housing for people. It doesn't matter whether they're owners or renters. There's simply not enough stock. What you want to do ideally is encourage people to be investing in that investment class and building new houses and renting houses out to people. And so by engaging in this kind of policy and making the investment less attractive, you're going to be slowing down the rate at which that stock increases. And B, the second thing, and I think the more important thing, or at least the thing that will have the greatest effect, as someone who's been a landlord myself, you know, under the old dispensation, a tenant comes to you, they want to rent your house, and maybe there are things about them that put you on guard, so to speak. And you think, well, hey, I can give this person a 1-year lease and we'll just give it a go. And they may or may not work out. But if they do work out, we can look at making it a longer, more fixed deal, and it'll be great. And now under the new thing, you have to be very, very careful about who you put in your house. And I think that will ultimately disadvantage the very people the government is most trying to help. It'll have, because we know that there's a certain level of bias in this country, and some of it's racial, a lot of it's economic and weighted against people that are poor. And those are the people that are most vulnerable to the changes in landlord decision making.
So the discrimination essentially goes on before the landlord tenant relationship even gets the chance to commence.
Exactly. I mean, if you've got, if say you've got some sort of bias, whether it's against people of a certain race or whether it's against people from a certain socioeconomic milieu, so you think because of that bias, they're more likely than the average person to be a bad tenant, whether that's because you think they're less likely to be able to pay the rent or that they're more likely to cause damage.
Yeah.
If you've got that mindset, and let's be clear here, rightly or wrongly, I mean, there are a lot of people who have that mindset and it's wrong that they do, but we live in the real world, and some of the people in the real world do have that mindset and do lease houses to people. So if you've got those preconceived notions or biases and you're faced with the decision to rent a house to someone, knowing that once you've signed the lease, it's going to be incredibly difficult to get rid of that person if they don't pay the rent or cause damage or engage in sort of low-grade antisocial behavior, you're going to be very reluctant to rent to them.
Yeah. Because in a temporal sense, the decision has been moved to pre-selection, so to speak.
Yes, correct.
Before the relationship has even had the chance to be formed.
And I mean,
you're making that judgment earlier. So, I mean, I don't know how you'd ever test that other than anecdotally. Well, you couldn't, could you? Because you're not going to be able to get landlords or tenants to answer questions honestly as to whether or not they've been showing prejudice in selection of a tenant.
Of course, that's illegal, so no one's ever going to admit to it. No. It is going to be a very anecdotal thing. But I can tell you, like, one that isn't really charged with too much kind of emotion. You know, I think now when you look at who you rent a house to, say you're looking at a family versus a group of students, the group of students now look a lot more attractive than the family does. And the reason for that is that you know that those students have a shelf life. You know that they are not going to be in that house for longer than 2 or 3 years.
Yep.
Whereas the family could be there for 12 years, 15 years. Yep. And so immediately one of those groups of tenants looks a lot more attractive than the other one.
You know, there's something distorted about the legislation when landlords are taking groups of students.
Yeah, well, that's right.
Over the supposed, underpinning lynch, sort of
the linchpin of society,
the linchpin, the fulcrum of society, the nuclear family, getting ousted at the expense of
it does
heretical couch burning scarfies.
It does seem to be not particularly well thought through.
What about advice for people or persons considering becoming commercial landlords? We're just doing some DD this afternoon, which is completely coincidental. We don't do a huge volume of commercial property at Lateral Lawyers, but we do a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
We've been asked under a lot of time duress to do DD so a wealthy client of ours can make a cash unconditional on a offer on a property tomorrow. I believe he's gone down with his measuring wheel down to Tauranga as we speak. He's got this thing in his head about that value is not measuring properties properly, which is pretty comical. But, hey, look, whatever you got to do to satisfy yourself. But looking at all the DD material for him, looking at the leases, and he's planning on using it really as a to future-proof his business, because he's got a very good one of his sites for his very well-known household business is down in Tauranga. But looking at the materials and looking through the leases and looking at the some of the plans and the just everything else surrounding commercial property, and given you've been a landlord at times, I understand you assist your family and other clients with commercial property advice. What are the things to think about for someone thinking about getting into commercial property as an asset class over, and the distinctions, again, an easy one, residential property?
Well, I think the first thing to say, Shane, is that the sort of people who are, so to speak, thinking of getting into that class, generally speaking, are going to be people who are maybe residential landlords. And I would kind of mirror the caution of the banks as a first piece of advice. I would say that to do it, you need to have a portfolio of assets of sufficient size that to be putting, if like, you can't be putting all your eggs in one basket. If a commercial property worth $2 or $3 million represents a significant chunk of your portfolio, then you should be very careful about it, because it's not a particularly liquid asset.
Yep.
And it's an asset with quite a high level of risk compared to residential. With residential, typically the cost, these days actually, the cost of a residential house versus the cost of a commercial building, there's almost parity, which is kind of incredible. But it's much, much easier to rent out residential realty.
Yep.
when it comes to commercial, you've got the risk. You've always got the risk that you have an anchor tenant go, you have part of the building or all of your premises falling vacant, and it can take a long time to re-tenant them. So you need to kind of be going into it knowing that the amount of money, the amount of capital you're putting up, if that suffered a period where it wasn't receiving much return, if any, that you could handle that, that would be the first piece of advice I'd give someone.
I know a wealthy property investor who is an airline steward, and he actually, it's an amazing story. He pretty much lost everything in '87, got back into property, bought a gym in Newmarket in the '90s, flipped that, I think, for double what he paid within 14 months, got into something else, got property all over the place. He bought this reasonably dilapidated monster of a building in Epsom, I think at the beginning, or maybe it was just before the pandemic, and he bought it off a mortgagee, and either off the mortgagee or it was so distressed that it was about to be sold by the mortgagee, one of the two. And it was a recording studio, and it had these. I went and had a coffee with him there last year, and he had this phenomenal like rooms with all the different machines and plugs, and it's incredible. And he bought it for something outrageous, like I think it was about 2 or 2.5 mil under CV. and just the reason I'm talking about that, other than it's a cool story because he's done so well, is that it was only someone like him who had so many net assets and ability to fund through the cash flows of the other investment properties that he'd built up, that he was able to buy this thing, which was untenanted at the time, and in many ways untenantable, at least in a short run, particularly mainly because of COVID, but also just because of the state of some of the building. And he said that even if he flicked it, even if he was only able to hold it for a year or 18 months, he budgeted how much it would cost him over that time, and he would still be able to flick it for no less than, he reckoned, $1 million more than he'd paid for it. So that was all factored in. So, I mean, maybe it is more people like that that are actually buying residential property these days, as opposed to people that need to be worried about backed into that corner in terms of it's your only asset and it's potentially of maybe negligible value when compared to the returns on other asset classes, both in terms of return and risk.
Well, I mean, certainly cash is king, and it's a great example of the sort of that principle in the Bible, to he who has much, much will be given. In any kind of cycle where an asset class is distressed, that represents a big opportunity for people that can get in when things are cheap and put up with a period of low returns.
Yeah.
It's very true.
Yeah, no, this guy's stories, we're actually going to get him on here at some point. It's a real cool story. He said that other people were absolutely shocked that he was able to basically just soft pedal his way into a whole lot of commercial property after working in New Zealand for 40 odd years. And he said I know this guy did this, he spent like hours and hours and hours of his free time and his weekend time and his mental space thinking and plotting and getting close to people who with know-how. And he said the bloody being on the plane and working those jobs was like the ultimate way of being able to meet people and apply them for information and build contacts. And he was able to, through that career and just through sheer determination, be able to cobble together enough money to get a start, and then kept parlaying all of those investments into more investments, which is pretty cool,
Well, I think to that I'd say, to kind of be less curmudgeonly than my opening comment on this topic, that people shouldn't be afraid of that investment class either. Like, it's not as complicated relative to residential as it may appear from the outside. And particularly, I would say that you want to, due diligence. I mean, that's important. Buying any significant asset, it becomes very important. With a commercial building, there's a lot of things to be mindful of, like earthquake strengthening, hazards within the building like asbestos, a range of other concerns. But, as long as you've got good professional advisors around you, it's not really that difficult to invest in commercial realty.
No. but just to stress what Mike said there before we wrap this up tonight, because I've had a long day, Mike's had a long day, and I suspect from the low viewership, that's the reason, is that a lot of people have had a long day. We've just passed the longest day, and get good professional advice if you're looking at buying commercial property. Like Mike said, it's not rocket science. It's not that different to residential in a lot of ways. There's only a handful more of considerations that you actually need to turn your mind, but you'd be absolutely blown away if I told you how many people don't, even really experienced commercial people, get emotionally attached to something. They believe that they're going to miss out. The agent tells them, look, such and such is coming down the road. He's cash unconditional. He's from the Jones family. The Jones family is going to blow you away. Blah, blah. It happens on the spot. And just to, unless you've been burnt or you are really experienced or just really savvy, don't make rash emotional decisions when entering into agreements. Come and see someone like us first. Go through DD, go get LIM reports, geotechnical reports, like Mike said, earthquake strengthening reports, find out, through us, whether or not you're going to need any kind of building consents, resource consents, are they all in place? Looking at all the planning requirements, just really exhaust all that. But yeah, once you've done all that, find a good asset and pull the trigger and, hope for the best.
I'll jump on the end of that and say also, Shane, there's no such thing as a good or bad asset. There's just good or bad prices. Anything at the right return.
Yeah, except for maybe some of the absolutely born to lose cryptocurrency that some of our clients have been buying lately. And you know who you are. You're probably watching this because you're one of our few loyal viewers. But some of this stuff, I mean, Bitcoin and Ethereum, which I'm big on, I mean, that alone, I mean, all of it doesn't exist. None of it exists, right?
See,
this stuff worse than doesn't exist. It's the sort of stuff you wish never existed because it's literally.
Shane, I bought a bunch of it maybe 3 years ago, and I just dabbled and bought 30 or 40 different coins that were all pretty dubious. Basically, lost all my money. But fortunately, I bought about 2 or 3 Link. And they've done so well that, I haven't exactly made a killing, but I am ahead. But I had a taxi driver, an Uber driver the other day, shilling me a particular coin that I'd never heard of. And I was reminded, I think it was Kennedy Sr., JFK's father, said that before the stock market crash, he had his shoeshine boy shilling him stocks. And that was the moment that he went and sold everything.
So you saying in 2021, a taxi driver...
When your Uber driver is trying to sell you cryptocurrency...
Get out.
Yeah, that's a sign.
What about if your clients are trying to get you into it? Depends what sort of law firm you are, right?
Depends what they're selling, I guess.
You don't even want to know. All right, mate. Thanks very much for coming on. It's good to be back.
Pleasure to be here, Shane.
Cheers, mate.